I was bouncing my 18-month-old daughter Emma on my lap in the departure lounge at Phoenix Sky Harbor, trying desperately to soothe her crying, when this woman stormed over and unleashed the most vicious verbal attack I'd ever experienced. As a mother, your brat is ruining everyone's travel experience, she shrieked, her face twisted with rage. Some of us paid good money for peace and quiet, and you clearly have no business flying with a screaming child. The entire gate area fell silent as this airport Karen continued her tirade, calling my baby uncontrolled and demanding that security remove us from the terminal immediately. What she didn't know was that my crying daughter and I were rushing to my mother's deathbed, and this entitled passenger had just picked a fight with someone who had both the authority and the resources to make her regret every word of her airport drama. Let me paint you the full picture of how this travel nightmare began. 3 days earlier, I'd received the call that every daughter fears. My mother, who had raised me as a single parent after my father died when I was 12, had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, had given her maybe a week to live. I was living in Scottsdale, Arizona, working as a federal prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I needed to get to my mother's bedside with my baby daughter, possibly the only grandchild she'd ever meet. The timing couldn't have been worse. Emma was going through a difficult phase, cutting her molars and dealing with a double ear infection that made flying particularly uncomfortable for her tiny ears. My pediatrician had cleared her for travel, but warned me that the altitude changes could cause significant discomfort. I'd packed every comfort item I could think of, her favorite blanket, teething toys, children's Tylenol, and even a letter from her doctor explaining her medical condition in case airline staff had questions about her fussiness during the flight. I'd booked us on the earliest flight I could find, a 6 a.m. departure that would get us to Minneapolis St. Paul by noon, then a connecting flight to Rochester. The red-eye timing meant Emma would be tired and cranky, but it also meant fewer passengers and hopefully more understanding from fellow travelers who might have children of their own. I'd even called the airline ahead of time to explain our situation and ask about upgrading to first class where we'd have more space and potentially more patient fellow passengers. The gate agent had been sympathetic, but explained that the first-class cabin was completely sold out. However, she'd said with a knowing smile, "Sometimes things change at the last minute. Keep your boarding passes handy, and I'll see what I can do if any seats open up." Emma had been relatively calm during our early morning drive to the airport, and even through the security checkpoint. But the moment we settled into the hard plastic chairs of Gate A7, her discomfort became impossible to ignore. She started with soft whimpering, then escalated to full crying as other passengers began arriving for the 6 a.m. flight. I tried everything, walking her around the terminal, offering her bottle, singing softly, even letting her play with my phone, which usually distracted her for at least a few minutes. Nothing worked. The pain in her ears from the infection, combined with the exhaustion of being awake at 5 a.m., had pushed my normally sweet-tempered daughter into a full meltdown. I felt terrible for the other passengers, but I also knew that this was temporary. Once we were airborne and her ears equalized, she'd likely fall asleep from sheer exhaustion. Most of the early morning travelers seemed understanding. A few older women smiled sympathetically and offered tips about flying with babies. A businessman even joked that his own kids had done the same thing at that age. But Airport Karen was a different story entirely. She'd arrived at the gate about 20 minutes after us, wheeling an expensive designer suitcase and carrying what looked like a first-class boarding pass. She was probably in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in what I recognized as a several $1,000 outfit, and she had that particular air of entitlement that comes from never being told no in her adult life. The moment she heard Emma's crying, her face contorted into an expression of pure disgust. At first, she just shot dirty looks in our direction while talking loudly on her phone about how some people had no consideration for others. But as Emma's crying continued, she was really struggling with the ear pain now. Airport Karen's patience reached its breaking point. "Excuse me," she said, marching over to where I was sitting. "How long is this going to go on?" I looked up from trying to comfort Emma, my heart already racing from the stress of the situation. "I'm so sorry," I said sincerely. "She has an ear infection, and the early morning is making it worse. I'm trying everything I can to calm her down." "Well, you're not trying hard enough," she snapped. "I paid for a peaceful travel experience, and your child is making that impossible. Can't you give her something to make her stop?" The suggestion that I drug my baby to accommodate her comfort level was so outrageous that I almost couldn't believe she'd said it. "She's 18 months old," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "She's in pain from an ear infection, and we're traveling to see my dying mother. I'm doing everything I can." "Your dying mother?" Airport Karen let out a harsh laugh. "Oh please, everyone has a sob story these days. That doesn't give you the right to ruin everyone else's flight with your screaming brat." The cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, already emotionally devastated about losing my mother, exhausted from caring for a sick baby, and trying to navigate one of the most difficult trips of my life, and this entitled passenger thought her minor inconvenience trumped a family emergency. "Mum, I understand this is frustrating," I said, my voice starting to shake with emotion, "but I'm doing my best in a very difficult situation." "Your best isn't good enough," she shouted, loud enough for the entire gate area to hear. "Some of us are trying to sleep before an important business meeting. Your inability to control your child is affecting paying customers who actually matter." That's when Emma, perhaps sensing the tension and hostility in Airport Karen's voice, started crying even harder. The poor little thing was overwhelmed by pain, exhaustion, and now the scary energy of an adult screaming near her. I pulled her closer to my chest, trying to shield her from the hostile woman towering over us. "Look what you've done now," Airport Karen continued. She's even louder. "This is completely unacceptable. I'm calling the gate agent right now to have you removed from this flight." And that's exactly what she did. She stormed over to the check-in counter, where a young gate agent was trying to manage the early morning flight preparations, and launched into a tirade that could be heard throughout the terminal. "I demand that you remove that woman and her screaming child from this flight immediately," she announced loudly. "She's disrupting everyone's travel experience, and I refuse to be trapped on an airplane with that noise for 4 hours. I'm a million-miler with this airline, and I expect you to prioritize paying customers who actually know how to behave in public." The gate agent, barely out of college and clearly overwhelmed by Airport Karen's aggressive approach, looked nervously in my direction. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but unless there's a safety issue there is a safety issue," Airport Karen interrupted. "That screaming is going to cause passengers to lose sleep, which could lead to medical emergencies. And what if that child has something contagious? I demand to see her medical records right now." The medical records demand was the final straw that transformed this from a simple complaint into something much more serious. Under federal law, demanding access to someone's private medical information without proper authority is a violation of HIPAA privacy regulations. Airport Karen had just crossed from being a difficult passenger into territory that involved federal healthcare privacy crimes, but she wasn't done yet. Over the next 30 minutes, she escalated her campaign against my sick baby and me into a full-scale airport drama that would define both of our travel experiences. She demanded to speak to supervisors, threatened to file complaints with the airline's corporate headquarters, and even suggested that I was an unfit mother who shouldn't be allowed to travel alone with a child. "Look at her," she announced to anyone who would listen. "She clearly can't handle basic parenting responsibilities. That baby has been screaming for almost an hour, and she hasn't been able to do anything about it. Someone needs to call Child Protective Services before she gets on an airplane and puts everyone at risk." The CPS threat was particularly cruel because it struck at every parent's deepest fear, having your fitness a mother questioned by strangers based on a single difficult moment. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as other passengers started staring and whispering among themselves. Some looked sympathetic, but others seemed to be buying into Airport Karen's narrative that I was somehow negligent or incompetent. Emma was still crying, though more quietly now as exhaustion began to overtake her pain. I held her close and whispered soft reassurances, trying to block out Airport Karen's continued verbal assault while also preparing myself for the possibility that we might actually be denied boarding. If that happened, we'd miss our connection in Minneapolis, and I might not make it to my mother's bedside in time. The gate agent had called over a supervisor, a middle-aged woman who looked like she'd dealt with difficult passengers before. Airport Karen immediately launched into her demands, insisting that airline policy required the removal of disruptive passengers and that my crying baby constituted a safety hazard. "Mum," the supervisor said diplomatically, "crying babies are a normal part of air travel. Unless there's evidence of neglect or abuse, we can't remove passengers simply because their child is upset." Evidence of neglect. Airport Karen's voice reached a new octave of indignation. "She's been letting that brat scream for over an hour. If that's not neglect, I don't know what is. And I'm telling you right now, if you force me to sit through 4 hours of that noise, I'm filing lawsuits against this airline for creating a hostile travel environment." The lawsuit threats were clearly making the airline staff nervous. In today's litigious climate, customer service representatives are trained to avoid any situation that might result in legal action, even when the complaints are unreasonable. I could see the supervisor wavering, and I realized that Airport Karen's entitled behavior might actually succeed in getting us kicked off the flight. That's when I decided it was time to level the playing field and reveal exactly who she was dealing with. You see, I hadn't mentioned this earlier, but my position as a federal prosecutor wasn't just any government job. I was the assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the District of Arizona's Public Integrity Section, specializing in federal crimes involving transportation, interstate commerce, and civil rights violations. I'd spent the last 8 years prosecuting exactly the kinds of federal crimes that Airport Karen was committing right in front of multiple witnesses. I reached into my carry-on bag and pulled out my federal credentials, a badge and identification card that clearly identified me as a prosecutor with the United States Department of Justice. I'd hoped to avoid using my official position for what should have been a simple family emergency trip, but Airport Karen's escalating behavior had left me no choice. "Excuse me," I said quietly to the airline supervisor, showing her my federal ID. "I need to speak with you privately about this situation." The supervisor's eyes widened as she examined my credentials. "You're a federal prosecutor, assistant U.S. attorney for the District of Arizona," I confirmed. "And I need to inform you that the passenger who's been making these complaints has committed multiple federal crimes in the past hour." We stepped away from Airport Karen, who was still ranting to anyone who would listen about her rights as a paying customer. I explained to the supervisor that demanding access to private medical records without authority was a PAA violation, that threatening to file false CPS reports constituted intimidation and harassment, and that her discriminatory behavior toward a mother traveling with a sick child could potentially violate federal civil rights protections. Additionally, I continued, her threats to file false lawsuits if she doesn't get her way constitute extortion and could be prosecuted under federal anti-racketeering statutes. I have multiple witnesses and I'm prepared to file formal charges, if necessary. The supervisor nodded grimly. "What do you need from us, Ms. Rodriguez?" "First, I need you to document everything she said and done for potential evidence. Second, I need airport security to detain her for questioning about these federal violations. And third," I paused, looking over at Airport Karen, who was now haranguing other passengers about their failure to support her complaints, I believe you mentioned that first-class seats sometimes become available at the last minute. The supervisor's face broke into the first genuine smile I'd seen from airline staff all morning. You know what? I think we just had a first-class passenger decide they didn't want to fly with us today after all. Within 10 minutes, the entire dynamic of the situation had shifted completely. Airport security officers were approaching Airport Karen, who was still oblivious to the fact that her airport drama was about to backfire spectacularly. The gate supervisor was processing our upgrade to first-class seats with extra space for Emma's car seat and diaper bag, and I was documenting everything for potential federal prosecution. Ma'am, the lead security officer said to Airport Karen, we need you to come with us to answer some questions about complaints that have been filed. Complaints. She sputtered. I'm the one who filed complaints. That woman over there with the screaming brat is the problem. Actually, the officer replied, the complaints are about your behavior. We've received reports of HIPAA violations, harassment, intimidation, and discriminatory conduct. You need to come with us now. The look of shock and confusion on Airport Karen's face was absolutely priceless. For the first time since this airport drama began, she was completely speechless. She looked around the gate area as if expecting other passengers to come to her defense, but everyone was either staring at their phones or actively avoiding eye contact. This is ridiculous. She finally managed to say, I'm the victim here. I'm a million-miler and a first-class passenger, and I'm being treated like a criminal. Actually, I said, stepping forward and showing her my federal credentials, you are being treated like a criminal because you've committed multiple federal crimes in the past hour. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Rodriguez, and I'll be filing charges for your HIPAA violations, harassment, and attempted extortion. The transformation on Airport Karen's face was remarkable. The entitled rage melted away and was replaced by shock, fear, and the dawning realization that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. She'd spent an hour attacking a federal prosecutor and her sick baby, thinking she could bully us into leaving the airport, and now she was facing serious legal consequences for her behavior. I didn't know ... double quotes, she stammered. This is all a misunderstanding. I was just trying to ... You were trying to have a sick baby and her mother removed from a flight because their family emergency inconvenienced you, I said calmly. You demanded access to private medical records, threatened false CPS reports, and used discriminatory language about a mother's fitness to travel with her child. All of that is documented, witnessed, and prosecutable under federal law as security. Escorted Airport Karen away for processing. Something beautiful happened. The other passengers in the gate area started applauding. It began with the elderly businessman who'd been sympathetic earlier, then spread to the families with children, and finally included nearly everyone who'd witnessed her entitled behavior. Thank you, said a young mother with twin toddlers. I've been afraid to fly with my kids because of people like her. It's good to see that there are consequences. A veteran in a military cap approached next. Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss, and thank you for standing up to that bully. Your mother raised you right. Even the gate agent, who'd been nervously trying to manage Airport Karen's complaints, came over to apologize. I'm so sorry you had to deal with that, she said. Your first-class seats are ready, and we've made sure you'll have priority boarding so you can get settled before other passengers. The upgrade to first class made all the difference for Emma's comfort. Instead of cramped economy seats where her crying might disturb dozens of passengers, we had a spacious pod with privacy dividers and flight attendants who were specifically trained to help families with young children. The moment we settled in and Emma realized she had room to move around, her demeanor improved dramatically. Is there anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable? Asked the lead flight attendant, a compassionate woman who'd obviously been briefed about our situation. Actually, I said, do you have any pediatric eardrops? Her infection is making the altitude changes really painful. Not only did they have medical supplies, but one of the flight attendants was a former pediatric nurse who helped me administer the ear drops and showed me some pressure relief techniques that would help Emma during takeoff and landing. By the time we were airborne, my daughter was sleeping peacefully in my arms, finally comfortable and pain-free. As our plane climbed into the morning sky, I received a text message update about Airport Karen's situation. Airport security had detained her for federal questioning, and she'd missed her own flight while being processed. The airline had also suspended her frequent flyer privileges pending investigation of her discriminatory behavior toward other passengers. But the most satisfying part of this Karen's story wasn't the legal consequences, it was the way the entire airport community had rallied around the principle that families deserve compassion and respect, especially during medical emergencies. Airport Karen's entitled behavior had backfired completely, and she'd learned the hard way that bullying federal prosecutors carries serious consequences. More importantly, her airport drama had created an opportunity to educate people about the challenges faced by traveling parents and the importance of showing grace to families dealing with difficult circumstances. Several passengers had approached me before takeoff to share their own stories about traveling with sick children, and many had expressed gratitude that someone had finally stood up to the kind of entitled passenger behavior they'd witnessed, but felt powerless to address. During the flight, Emma slept peacefully against my chest while I worked on my laptop, preparing the formal federal charges I would file against Airport Karen upon our return to Arizona. PAA violations, harassment, intimidation, and attempted extortion were all serious crimes that carried significant penalties, including potential jail time and substantial fines. But beyond the legal consequences, I hope that Airport Karen's experience would serve as a warning to other entitled passengers who think they can bully families simply because they're dealing with challenging circumstances. Air travel is stressful for everyone, but that doesn't give anyone the right to attack mothers and babies who are already struggling with medical emergencies and family crises. When we landed in Minneapolis for our connecting flight, I received a call from my mother's doctor with an update on her condition. "She's been asking about you all morning," he said. "Her vitals have actually improved since yesterday, and she's determined to stay awake until you arrive." Tears of relief and gratitude streamed down my face as I realized that Airport Karen's attempt to derail our travel plans had ultimately failed. Not only were we going to make it to my mother's bedside in time, but we were traveling in comfort and style thanks to the airline's response to the situation. Emma woke up as we were preparing to disembark, and for the first time all day, she was smiling and babbling happily. The eardrops and altitude changes had relieved the pressure in her ears, and she was back to her normal, cheerful self. Several passengers stopped to comment on how adorable she was, and I couldn't help but think about how different their reactions might have been if Airport Karen's narrative had succeeded in portraying us as the problem. Our connecting flight to Rochester was smooth and uneventful. Emma remained calm and happy throughout the journey, occasionally charming fellow passengers with her smiles and giggles. The flight crew, who'd been alerted to our earlier experience, went out of their way to ensure our comfort and even brought Emma a small stuffed animal, a gift. As we descended into Rochester, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for how the day had unfolded. What had started as a travel nightmare had ultimately become a powerful demonstration of airport justice and the importance of standing up to entitled behavior. Airport Karen had thought she could intimidate a young mother traveling alone with a crying baby, but she'd picked the wrong person on the wrong day. When we finally arrived at Mayo Clinic, my mother was awake and waiting for us. Despite her illness, her face lit up the moment she saw Emma, and she spent the next hour holding her granddaughter and listening to her babble. It was exactly the kind of precious moment that Airport Karen had tried to prevent with her selfish demands and entitled behavior. "Tell me about your flight," my mother said as Emma played with her hospital bracelet. I smiled and looked down at my daughter, who was now happy and healthy and completely unaware of the airport drama that had surrounded her earlier that morning. Let's just say justice was served at 30,000 feet, I replied, that evening. As I sat beside my mother's hospital bed with Emma sleeping peacefully in my arms, I reflected on the events of the day. Airport Karen's meltdown had backfired spectacularly, teaching her and everyone who witnessed it that entitled behavior has consequences. But more importantly, it had demonstrated the power of community support and the importance of protecting families who are dealing with difficult circumstances. My phone buzzed with a text message from the airline supervisor. Wanted you to know that passenger has been permanently banned from our airline network. Thank you for your professionalism in handling the situation. I showed the message to my mother, who smiled weakly but with obvious satisfaction. Your father would be proud, she whispered. You stood up for what was right, and you protected your daughter from that woman's cruelty. As I looked out the hospital window at the peaceful Rochester skyline, I felt a deep sense of contentment and closure. Airport Karen had learned the hard way that discriminating against families and abusing federal aviation regulations carries serious consequences. Her airport drama had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of entitled passenger behavior, and justice had been served in the most satisfying way possible. Emma stirred in my sleep and smiled up at me with those innocent eyes that had been the target of so much hostility just hours earlier. In the quiet of the hospital room, surrounded by the love of 3 generations of women, I knew that we'd not only survived our travel nightmare, but emerged stronger and more connected than ever before. The Karen had been owned, airport justice had prevailed, and most importantly, I was exactly where I needed to be with the 2 most important people in my life.